everybody to Let's Talk. And tonight, the topic is healing through bereavement, grief, and loss. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I speak from the land of the Camaragal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people who may be with us. So, are you all familiar with this topic, by the way? Can you give me a wave or whatever?
Yes.
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 Yes. Well, look, it would be pretty hard to get halfway through your life and not have experienced some form of grief. So the reason I wanted to talk about it is because it is such an important part of life. During our life, we experience little traumas, losses, which may be small, maybe huge, and maybe cataclysmic. The kinds of losses we can experience may be isolated and discrete. They may be ongoing, so they may go on for a very long period of time. For instance, if you have a loved one who has a long-term severe illness, like multiple sclerosis, something like that, and you're looking after them, or they, might be your parent or your partner or your child or, whoever. But some losses go on and on and on. And in many ways, I think that they are the most difficult losses to bear of all the different kinds of loss. A loss can be very sudden, unexpected, and, come straight out of the blue. Losses take all shapes and forms. And we generally, we can't particularly be prepared for them. Even when somebody dies and you've known for some time, maybe years and years, that they were going to die, even when they do die, you can't really prepare for that moment, because life happens in the moment. And, although we may know something's going to happen, and we prepare as best we can, there's only so much you can do. So a trauma is a loss, whether it's a real one or a threatened one. And if loss is threatened, I may get some bad news that tells me that I'm possibly going to lose my job, lose my partner, lose a parent, lose a loved one. There's going to be some terrible thing happen. It may not have happened yet, and it may not happen. But once I get wind of it, once I know that it could happen, that is the same, very much the same as if it is happening. A threatened loss is something I grieve. I need to grieve as well as an actual loss. And so we experience loss when we're deprived of something, or when we have to go without something that we've had, that we've valued, something that we needed, wanted, or expected. Minor losses or traumas are common and so subtle often that we don't even recognise that they are a loss. Yet all of our losses produce pain or unhappiness, and we call this train of feelings that follows, we call that train of feelings grief or mourning. And we also call it the process of grieving. And when we allow ourselves to feel these painful feelings, and when we share the grief with safe and supportive others, might be a friend, a counsellor, a family member, whoever, then we are able to complete our grief work and thus move on, be free of it. But to complete grief work can take time. It can take a long time. And the bigger the loss, the longer the time generally required. From minor loss, we may complete most of the grieving in a few hours, or days or weeks, or possibly even minutes. From moderate loss, we may require months to a year or longer. And for a major loss, then the time required for the healthy completion of grief could be several years. And look, I don't want to be prescriptive about this. A lot of people are, but I don't think it's appropriate, because I find that grief is extremely subjective. And, you know, that's why I don't feel I can say, you know, well, you shouldn't be still grieving after 6 months to someone, or after a year or something, because I haven't lived that person's life. I don't know what they're feeling inside, and I can only imagine and attempt to understand what's happening for them. However, it's really not possible to know what is happening inside another human being. And so unresolved grief is a problem. As I say, grieving is something we really do need to do in our lives, because we do experience losses. And, you know, when I look back over my life, I'd say, you know, there have been many, many losses. And learning to deal with them. When we sort of get used to grief and going through the grieving process in a healthy way, and by that I mean not consciously or unconsciously blocking it. Because unresolved grief is dangerous. Delayed grief will cause problems. The grief we don't experience is going to cause problems down the line. And the longer we leave, we leave it to grieve a loss. If we repress it, and sometimes, look, there are very good reasons for repressing grief. Sometimes we just can't grieve it in the moment. Imagine a young mother who loses her husband and she's got some young kids to look after, and her husband's maybe had a business, and then she has to step in and deal with the business and try and look after some young children and just cope from day to day. She is not going to be able to grieve appropriately because she's going to have to try and just carry on in the moment and keep the show on the road. And there are also cultural issues around grief, particularly here in Australia. You know, we've still got a lot of that British Victorian sort of hangover, this stiff upper lip and all that rubbish. And, you know, I remember when I was a kid, my grandmother saying to me, "Oh, you must never show your feelings in public, Judy." I mean, fancy saying that to a kid. Kids run on feelings. They show their feelings all the time. Fortunately, my mother corrected her in front of me and said, don't tell her that. It's nonsense. So, yes, unresolved grief and delayed grief really can become a huge problem, and they can cause health issues. They can cause mental health issues. And generally, I mean, I'm sure I've said this before on this program in at least one of these sessions, that what we repress, we don't express. And as a result, we get depressed, because emotions are energy. Grief is energy. And if we repress it and push it down and try and kind of get rid of it so that we don't have to feel it, then we really block our own energy. And what a lot of people can do when they do have a loss, and the bigger the loss, the more they may do this, is that they will try and avoid that loss by immediately bringing a big diversion into their life. And it could be drugs, alcohol, it could be a relationship, an affair, taking on a whole lot of work, exercising way too much. There are all kinds of ways that people deal with grief, or think they're dealing with the grief, which is just trying to get rid of it. And the fact is that it does not simply go away because you repress it. No matter how successfully you attempt to repress it, it's still there. And it's going to come and cause problems down the line. And as I said, they can be physical problems, they can be aches and pains, terrible headaches. Every time we have a loss, we experience a loss of self-esteem. A trauma or a loss causes a loss of self-esteem. That is the reality. Because loss and trauma stir up energy inside us that needs to be discharged. You know, I like to think of everything as energy, and I know I talk this language here, and so emotional energy is very real. And when it's stirred up, it does need to be discharged. And when we don't discharge the energy, stress builds up inside us, and it can cause a state for us of chronic distress. Some people call it chronic shock. And so if this is not released, then this chronic distress is stored within us as, you know, as tension, and at first it can be difficult to recognise. This is why I think education around grief is actually really important. Because when we do have a loss, the best thing we can do is take the time to grieve the loss rather than try and avoid it or, as I said, sometimes it's unavoidable. Someone simply has got to carry on because of their circumstances. But if those circumstances don't exist, then we need to grieve. And if we can grieve when the loss occurs and in the immediate aftermath of the loss, then we're giving ourselves the best chance of working through that loss in a healthy way and in a way that is not going to cause us any lasting problems or damage. Now, often people will have suffered losses in our childhood and have carried them into our adult life for the simple reason that there was nobody there when we were a kid to help us to really get in touch with our feelings and make it permissible for us to grieve. And if that has been the case, if someone's grown up with adverse childhood conditions, if there was abuse or violence or perhaps some form of addiction or affairs or, death or a loss or whatever, and the family didn't kind of deal with that sort of thing too well, and that child hasn't had their grief made real for them. They haven't been experienced, some comforting arms and someone talking to them about how they feel, about their sadness and so on, then, if other people in the family are being tight-lipped about it and repressing and not acknowledging the grief, then children also won't have permission to grieve, and which is horrible for them. It's horrible for everyone. But, this is a feature of many cultures, not just ours. And or if for some reason I believe that I should be strong when somebody dies, somebody who perhaps I've depended on, who I've lived with for a long period of time, who I've loved deeply, if I'm trying to be strong for the other family members or whatever, then I'm not going to grieve and I'm not going to give anyone else permission to grieve either. Look, a lot of this goes on in family systems, and so we need to get real about grief, because the family that grieves well lives well. So I just wanted to mention that about troubled or dysfunctional families, kids growing up in those, that they will often be carrying grief into their adult life. And when loss is ungrieved, it will over time cause a lot of unnecessary confusion and suffering. So sometimes, when we're carrying these grief issues, then what's a good idea is actually to start writing our life story from as far back as we can remember, from our very earliest memories. Just start writing our life story when we're alone. And that's that link between the subconscious mind and the hand whether you're handwriting or using a computer, I have to say, I think handwriting is better. But whatever, whatever you prefer to write with, then we can begin our grief work. And if we are, the reason this might be necessary is if someone has just a kind of general emotional malaise, depression, that's been building up for years. And so it's important for us when we come to this to identify our losses, our past losses, and to identify our needs, our feelings, and we need to share our feelings with at least one other person. So, identifying our losses, that's something I can do by just writing myself, keeping a journal and writing, or I can, maybe there's a friend or a counsellor or a family member, a sibling, or a cousin or someone like that, parent, someone that I feel comfortable talking to, that I can start to unpack. It helps me to start unpacking these stories. And so, lots of things cause loss, and it might be an important person, it might be a separation, a divorce, a rejection, an abandonment, a death, might be a stillbirth or an abortion, a geographical move, children leaving home, that kind of thing. And might be part of ourself, we may have a loss of body image. So we may be in an accident and lose physical function, lose control, have a loss of control, loss of self-esteem or independence or ego or expectations or lifestyle. We may lose our job, our career for some reason as a result of an accident or whatever. And then there are the childhood losses. Perhaps we didn't have healthy parenting. Perhaps we didn't get our needs met as a kid. Perhaps we weren't able to go in a healthy way, pass through the healthy kind of development stages of childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. And so there could have been threats of loss or separation or divorce as well. And as I say, they set up a grieving process too. And transitions, life transitions are times when we grieve. Crises, midlife crises, which kind of happen any time between childhood and death. We could lose money or property or a way of life. We could lose, our money, our assets, our perhaps sentimental objects or collections. There's people who've been through floods and fires know all about loss, all about very sudden losses of way of life and of having their things, their own nest, their own home with all their things in it and their family. And so loss is always very personal. It can be partial, complete, or uncertain or ongoing. It can be multiple or cumulative, but it may also be very symbolic. And since loss is such a universal experience, we encounter it, on a daily basis sometimes and overlook it. I walk into my office, I say good morning to the boss ignores me. I feel there's a little sense of loss that happens because of that. And that might take me, a few minutes to get over. It might take me a couple of hours to get over. Might even take longer. But sometimes when I experience the loss, it will just tap straight into past ungrieved losses that are similar or that are just sitting there waiting to explode. Have you felt like you were a ticking time bomb? Or seen someone who you could describe that way? I certainly have. And that's because an ungrieved loss remains forever alive in our unconscious. Our unconscious has no sense of time. And so past losses are just a reminder of a loss. Will evoke a fear of further loss in the future. So the loss I have today could stir up a whole lot of really, really deep grief energy from my early childhood, depending on, how I've been able to manage grief in the past. And loss can be really overwhelming. And so whether it's mild or whether it is really overwhelming, as I say, we can never judge what someone else is going through. We can't judge what we ourselves are going through. I might think, how come I am in such a fury because the boss didn't say good morning to me? And that's because something has been tapped into that's really deep. And I don't have any conscious recollection of it at the moment. So this is when counsellors and some grief counselling becomes a really good idea. And so let's look at the stages of grief. And I'm just going to share my screen with you. Right. So grief has been in the past identified as something that occurs in stages. Now, I have to say that certain people in my profession have argued very strongly and forcefully against this stages idea. But rather than getting into an argument about this sort of theory, I just want to explain a little bit about the origin of grief, or the origin of how we understand grief today. And this is sort of going on the identification of grief, I have to tell you, is fairly recent. Identifying the process of grieving is actually very recent. And it's happened in my lifetime. It happened with a woman, a psychiatrist by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she was a Swiss doctor who went through medical school with an American. She married him and they went back to live in America, back to New York, and they lived in New York. And she had her medical degree and she got in a job in a hospital in New York, and they put her in a ward with people who were dying. And So she was working with these people, and this was at a time, this is like in the 60s. And at that time, we didn't ever talk about death. You know, if someone was dying, the doctor wouldn't tell them. And even if they worked it out, or the doctor did tell them, then it wouldn't be mentioned in the family. It was like a big taboo subject. Death was taboo. It's very odd how incredibly repressed our Western culture has been, particularly in the 19s. It's a lot better now. It's a lot better now. It's not, I've still got a long way to go, I think. But Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was in this period where death was a taboo subject to talk about. And so there she was working with the dying people in this ward. You know, it was like a palliative care ward. Everybody was dying. And so she used to go and talk to the patients. And through talking to the patients and also to the relatives for, you know, for a few years, she discovered that people were going through a very definite process. And she identified these stages of grief. And the first stage was denial. That when the sick person's blood test came back, and the doctor gave them the results and told them they had cancer or whatever, and perhaps they wouldn't have very long to live, they could go into denial and say, oh, they must have mixed up the blood samples at the lab. Couldn't possibly be me. Look, this has happened to a friend of mine, I remember, back in the 1980s in America. I had a friend who was in the 80s. It was 1984, and he was diagnosed with AIDS, HIV AIDS, which was just emerging at the time. And he got very sick and he was put into hospital. And he called me in an absolute rage because the doctors had told him he had HIV AIDS. And he said, they're lying and I'm going to sue every one of them. And, you know, this was also at a time when homosexuality was still criminal, and a lot of people were not coming out. And it was cataclysmic, you know, for many, many young men were just going through, I think the whole gay community were just going through massive upheaval at that time in America, and of course, obviously elsewhere with what was happening. So he was outraged. And he said to me, you know, I'm going to sue every one of these doctors. And it wasn't my blood, it was somebody else's. And I wasn't a counsellor in those days. I didn't quite know what to say. So I didn't say anything. I just listened to him and validated his feelings. I got that bit right. And I said to him, I'll come in and see you tomorrow. And I did. I went in to see him the next day after I finished work. And when I walked into his room, he looked at me and he said, Jude, I've got AIDS. And we both cried. Yes, so that was an awful thing. And so that's denial. That's how denial and that anger can really feed into the denial as well. This is not an unusual response to finding out, to getting news you really don't want. As I say, it can be overwhelming. And so what Kubler-Ross discovered, let me just bring this up. Yes, here we go. Her 5 stages of dying. So beginning with denial. Now, denial, I mean, it might last a few minutes, a few hours, could last a few weeks, could last months, could last years, depending on what's happening. And anger can kick in pretty quick, particularly if a person has been given bad news that they're going to lose the person they really love and depend on, or lose their own life. The bigger the loss, basically, the bigger the reaction. And so that can move in time. And again, I'm not going to be prescriptive about any kind of time period for this, because it just varies from person to person, and from the magnanimity of the loss, is going to be a huge factor as well. So I used to see it when my first job as a rookie counsellor, I was working in a detox and rehab for women and their children. And when people give up a drug or alcohol or something else, they go through this process very identifiably, I might say. So I used to find that women would come into the unit, and of course they wouldn't be using, and after a day or two they'd say, hey, I don't have a problem with addiction. And I'd say, we'd say, oh yeah, really, why not? Because I haven't used for a day or 2 days or a week or whatever it was. And, I'm okay. So that is what we call bargaining. I'm okay, I can probably just go and have a few drinks and I'm going to be fine, or I can go and snort some coke or smoke a few joints or whatever it is. And that's the bargaining phase. So they're moving in and out. The person will move in and out of denial, anger, and bargaining. They can cycle through this stuff, God knows how many times a day. And but we used to see it with the women in the rehab, the detox unit and rehab I worked in. And this bargaining thing would click in. And they'd think that, oh, look, I'm absolutely fine. I don't need to be here. And we'd say, oh, well, actually you do. Think about the state you're in before you came in and what you've been through and blah, blah, blah. And, quite a few people used to leave. They'd say, no, I'm fine. They'd sign themselves out and off they'd go and use again. And they'd get right back into it. And then, after a few months or a year or something, they'd come back. Oh. But that, that's something people need to do with addiction when they're recovering from addiction. And eventually, this stage that's called depression, which I'm going to go into further, but it is that really dark night of the soul, that depression phase, when all hope seems to be lost. Life is not worth living anymore. Can't do this. whatever. And if we go deeply, deeply, deeply into the depression phase, or what Kubler-Ross called the depression phase, we now call passionate unhappiness or passionate sadness. And when we go very deeply into that, we do come out the other side. That is the good news, into this stage of acceptance. And so Kubler-Ross was doing her work in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And she has been dead for quite some time herself now. But she was her thing. She became a psychiatrist. And so her big thing was dying. And I have to say, it was the most incredible paradigm shift in the field of psychology and psychiatry. A massive paradigm shift, because what she gave us was a whole new way of thinking about dying and also about grieving, because what she noticed was that the relatives of the dying person were going through exactly the same process, identifiable process. Nowadays, we just talk about the process of grieving, and it's kind of been honed down a fair bit. So into a sort of roughly three-stage thing that happens. And as I say, it's not, we've got here stage 1 is shock, alarm and denial. And it's not as if that happens over a specific period of time and then we stop doing that and we go into acute grief. It all gets mixed up. So whilst we talk about stages, because it makes it a little bit easier to identify, there is a sort of what I have experienced in my own life with myself and seen in other people is this gradual movement from the shock, alarm and denial through the acute grief and through to the integration of the loss, which is what Kubler-Ross called the stage of acceptance. So I just want to talk about these 3 stages in a little bit of detail. And so the shock, alarm and denial will come on pretty immediately. And as I say, it might last a few minutes, a few days, a few hours. It may even last a few weeks or possibly even longer. But then the acute grief begins to set in. And so what is going on with the acute grief is a lessening of the denial, but it continues and it's intermittent. I know I experienced a couple of very significant losses in my life, and there's that just complete disbelief. It's like the mind cannot comprehend that the soul can be in the body 1 minute and not there the next. It's like, even with all my spiritual knowledge and all the years of meditation and life experience, I have to say, when my mother died, I was with her and I knew she was dying for years before she died, and certainly in the immediate lead up to her death, it was simply unmistakable. But it's like the mind simply cannot, the mind is so limited, it simply just doesn't understand how the soul can be there 1 minute and not the next, even for me when I watched it happen and I knew what was happening. The heart understands, however. The heart really does understand. And so acute grief consists of this sort of continuing, intermittent and lessening denial. There can be physical and psychological pain and distress, along with some contradictory pulls and emotions and impulses. And this thing goes on that we call searching behaviour. And I don't know if you've experienced it. I certainly have. And it might be after the loss, you know, maybe someone hasn't died, but the relationship has ended with a loved one or a partner, or it might be a death. And this what we call searching behaviour involves a preoccupation with thoughts of the loss. There's a compulsion to speak about the loss. We need to talk about it all the time. And there's a compulsion to retrieve what has been lost. A sense of waiting for something to happen. An aimless wandering and restlessness. A feeling of being lost, of not knowing what to do, an inability to initiate any activity, this kind of living in suspended animation, a feeling that of disorganisation and that life can never, ever be worthwhile again. There'll be confusion and feelings that things aren't real, and that, you know, all of the above just indicates that I'm completely losing it and that I have a mental illness. There'll be crying, anger, guilt, shame, loss of self-esteem. I may identify with traits or values or symptoms, tastes or characteristics of the lost person or thing. I may experience a regression or return to behaviours and feelings of an earlier age or time in my life, connected with a previous loss and reactions to that. I may experience helplessness and depression, maybe hope or hopelessness. And occasionally, after time, maybe I even experience a little bit of relief. And then over time, there's a decrease in the pain and an increasing capacity to cope over time. Now, this is what Kubler-Ross identified as the depression stage. I'm, you know, really going into that dark tunnel. And it's when I'm right in the middle of that dark tunnel, there is no light. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. It's just black. And that's the hopelessness. Life can never be worthwhile again. And then over time, there's a decrease in pain, in the intensity of the pain, and a capacity to cope. And then eventually I move into what I can only describe as a compulsion to find meaning in the loss. So I need to explore the loss at a deeper level. And get to a really, a deeper meaning. And often finding that symbolic meaning of the loss, it's very, very important for the grieving person. There will be, I begin to have thoughts of a new life without the lost person or job or situation, whatever it was. And then I begin to move out of the acute grief stage and into the integration stage. And there can be, two different outcomes of grief. And if the outcome goes in the welcome direction, then I will experience an acceptance of the reality of the loss and a return to physical and psychological stability and well-being. There'll be a diminished frequency and intensity of crying. There'll be restored self-esteem, a focus on the present and the future, an ability to enjoy life again, and a pleasure at the awareness of the growth from the experience and reorganisation of a new identity with restitution for the loss. And I then get to a point where I can remember the loss and speak of the loss with poignancy and caring instead of pain and tears. And this, obviously is a very good sign. If the outcome is unfavourable, then there'll be an acceptance of the reality of the loss with a lingering sense of depression, of physical aches and pains, a diminished sense of self-esteem, and a reorganisation of a new identity with a constriction of personality and involvement and vulnerability to other separations and losses. And look, I'll just explain what I mean by that. And I this happened a very long time ago, but I was working with someone, and she was a drug user, and just the most adorable woman. I mean, she was such a lovely young person, and she had her drug use had caused huge problems in her family. She had 4 kids. One was just hitting their teens, and the other one, the youngest, was a little new baby, about 5 months old. And her addiction to drugs had really broken up the marriage. And so she was in this unit I was working in, and she wanted to see her kids, and her husband was taking out his resentment and anger against her by not allowing her to see the children. So I said to her, well, why don't you call him, tell him where you are, because she was in rehab. Tell him you're clean, you haven't used anything for all these weeks, and that you would love to see the children. Would he bring them over to see you? And he needn't stay, and I tell him that you will pay for a taxi to send them home. And so she did that, and wonder of wonders, he said that he would bring the children over to see her, because they must have been missing their mother just terribly at this point. They hadn't seen her for quite some time, quite some time. I can't remember how long, but it was a long time. And it could have been 9 months, something like that. It's a long time for kids not to have any contact with their mum. And she had the little baby she did have with her in the unit. And so the kids came over with the husband, and afterwards she told me what had happened. She told me that, he just sort of looked at her and shook his head, and he said, if it weren't for you, we could have been so happy. Like it was all her fault. And none of it was to do with him. But if his behaviour hadn't been too good either, I can tell you. But anyway, we were laughing. And a very good friend of hers who lived near him, the kids, this best friend of hers had children the same age, and her children and my client's children used to they were friends. And so what this best friend said, she came to the unit to see this client, and she said that the husband, my client's husband, was getting this sort of string of girlfriends who looked like really identical to my client, and that was his way. This is typical behaviour of someone who is refusing to do their grief work. And of course, he has had a job and he had to look after the kids, and it's that situation. I talked about it initially. And this is what happens when people don't do their grief work, is that there is the real grief gets delayed, it gets put on hold. And so the person becomes very vulnerable to other separations and losses. And instead of growing, because when we go through the grieving process, we grow. But when we don't complete the grieving process, we don't grow, we shrink inside, we contract inside. So instead of experiencing that post-grief growth, we experience post-grief shrinking. It's like shrinking inside, contraction and constriction. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, we're back. So, how are we going for time? Oh, we're just a little bit over. Okay, so that is tonight's presentation on grief and loss. So if there are any questions, if you'd like to turn your cameras on and hit me with any questions.
Jude, I have one question on the chat box. You want to explain that?
I can't see your question, I'm sorry.
Okay, so basically my question is just, why is it that when we go to counselors, when we go so happy to see them, they come out crying, or vice versa? And little things later in life can actually trigger it, at any moment.
Well, it could be the sign of a good counselling session. Yes, you don't, a lot of people don't necessarily leave a counselling session feeling great until they, are getting towards the end of the counselling relation, period, the work, until the work is sort of getting done. you can frequently leave the counselling session in tears or whatever.
And I used to be so happy, so excited to go see the counsellor. And I used to be very happy to actually go and meet her. And yeah, come out crying, like 2 bucks of the tissues, Spanish.
Well, I think it's a sign that, the counselling was working, that you were doing what you needed to do with the counsellor. And, getting in, if you've got a good counsellor, in the process of counselling, because it is a process and it is working as it should be, then you are going to get in touch with past losses and, unresolved issues, unresolved things from the past that you really need to get in touch with whilst you're in session.
Yes, just another little question was, later in life, it can actually trigger at any moment. It's very sensitive because sometimes later in life, we think we have gone over that grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
But later in life, one little situation can just trigger it off.
That would indicate to me that there's still some grief work to do, or some work to do. I'm sorry to have to tell you that. That's probably not what you want to hear. But if we get triggered, there's something that we need to look at. It's that simple. I'm not going to get triggered if there's nothing there, if everything's resolved and there's nothing there. But if I am triggered, then something obviously is there to get triggered.
Thank you for sharing.
Can I ask a question?
Can
you hear me?
Not very well, but
I was interested when you were talking about the favourable and the unfavourable outcomes of grief.
Yes.
And the unfavourable is its acceptance of the reality of the loss, physical aches and pains, diminished self-esteem and restricted personality. And I wasn't sure what you meant by restricted personality.
A constriction of personality. It's just an internal constriction, because if we complete our grief work as is desirable, so we go, in other words, and thank you for asking this question, because it actually, I need to clarify this a bit better, obviously. When we go into the dark tunnel during the acute grief part of the process, if I go right in to the depths of that dark, dark tunnel where there is no light, and I experience my pain at its fullness, and I sit with it and I feel it. That's what we're meant to do. Then I will get to a point, it's like you go through a dip and you come up the other side, but you've got to go into the bottom of that dip. If you drew it grief as a graph, you have to go right to the bottom of the dip, and then only when you reach the bottom, that kind of rock bottom where it really, there just seems to be no future, absolutely nothing. You feel completely hopeless and helpless. Once you reach that spot, you will start to move back up. But if you don't, if you get into that dark tunnel and think, oh God, I'm not going in there, I don't want to go in there, and you block your own path, you just don't have the resources, the internal or external resources to really go completely into the dark tunnel, either because of your worldly responsibilities, it might be kids, it might be a business you've got to run, you've lost your partner, blah, 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 might be all that stuff. You just can't surrender at that level to the grief, or you simply don't want to feel that kind of pain because it's too painful. Don't want to feel it.
Can I just say, I've felt this constriction of my personality since my father passed away 17 years ago, which is a very long time now. And I believe that I've been down to the bottom many times, but my psychologist says that because the family house has still been there, and I've been the one who's been looking after it, and every time I go up there to look after this house, she says that I'm being re-triggered, and so I can't properly heal because, you know, all of my dad's, well, not all of my dad's stuff, but a lot of his stuff is still there, and I feel very close to the memories of him when I'm there, and so I'm just trying to. And my mother passed away 6 months ago, and like you said, it stirred up heaps of old losses, you know, especially the one of my father, such a long time ago. And right now I'm sort of right down in the depths again, right down. And but this time the family house is being sold, and that's like it's like saying goodbye to them all over again. It's a loss of a house, which, you know, is I've been used to having it there to go back and feel as if they might still be around there somewhere, you know, even though I sort of know they're not, but and so this is bringing up, you know, even more stuff. The loss of the house is bringing up the loss of both of them. But in a way, it could be a good thing if my psychologist is right, that you know, there won't be that triggering all the time anymore. Although I'm keeping an awful lot of their stuff, and that will trigger me, of course.
What this says to me, and I don't want to be prescriptive about it, or about what you need or about what you should be doing, but 17 years, as you say, is an awfully long time.
And yet it feels like a couple of months ago.
Yeah, that's right, because our unconscious has no sense of time.
Yeah.
So my sense is, now I may be wrong, but my sense is that you are holding on to the grief because it's your way of keeping mummy and daddy around.
Yeah, I think so.
And I do understand, you know, why people do this. And it is your choice. It is completely your choice. There's no law that says you shouldn't do this. However, if you don't wish to complete the grief work, it will inevitably keep you stuck in the tunnel and the pain of loss, where you're very vulnerable, you know, to being triggered and to experiencing loss. And a good grief counsellor should be able to help you if you are wanting, you know, if you're wanting to do some more work at some point, you know.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, that by staying in the grief, I can keep them around, feel as if they're still here, not letting go of them. Yeah,
that's right. It is a way of hanging on to mummy and daddy, and you know, there are reasons why people do this, and they're very, very subjective reasons, and I respect those reasons. And so working with this, I consider to be very important and a very delicate operation.
yeah, right.
You know, it's something I really, because I've seen a lot of clients who've been holding on to a loved one who died years ago and whatever. And it is something to be very honoured. And but it is also important work I think it's very important work to do, because getting stuck in life inevitably causes more pain than
it causes
anybody needs or wants, quite frankly. And that just keeps building up and building up over time. And we all have to leave home. All of us, you know, one of our major challenges in our adult life is to leave home and to say goodbye to mummy and daddy, emotionally and spiritually. And in Gestalt therapy, that is considered to be the first bit of psychotherapeutic work that we need to do.
Wow. Yeah. See, I haven't got my own family, so I think that's one reason I want to cling on to them.
Yes. Yeah. And look, I'm sure that there's more reasons than that. It's not the only reason. We are very complex beings, and grief is very complex. There are no black and white, straightforward, simple answers to these deep sort of human issues. But they're great to work with, from my perspective. And, you know, you can do very good work, very, very good work with these kinds of issues. You can really start to unravel the, you know, those complex knots of whatever's hiding underneath. And it's very freeing. Yeah, the family ghosts, and it's so freeing and so liberating. And
where are you based?
Oh, look, can we maybe have that discussion after the camera goes off, if you don't mind? I'm in Sydney, but after I stop recording, if you stay on the line, we'll have that chat, okay?
Okay.
But thank you for asking the question, because you elicited some very important information. It is very important information, because it is not an automatic thing that people complete their grief work. Lots of people do not. Lots of people, it can take so long of coming back and back and back over life. I've had people come to see me and they've said, look, I hate the fact that I have to come and see a therapist again because I've already seen 3 or 4 or 5 therapists about the same thing. And I keep, every time I think I've dealt with it, but then it's back. It rears its ugly head again. And I say, but this is normal, and this is, therapy is not a linear process any more than we are linear beings. We're not. And psychologically, we don't operate in a linear way. Sometimes, it might be a childhood issue and we try and deal with it, maybe in our 20s. And then again, in our 30s, it rears its ugly head again. And then again in our 40s and maybe 50s and maybe 60s or more. And the reason is that we deal with it to the extent that our capacity allows at the time with a particular therapist. It's not because the therapy was bad. It's about our own capacity to deal with it at that time. Mm. And then we'll find we've resolved part of it or parts of it. And then the parts that are unresolved will, of course, pop up again as we continue along in our life. This is normal. It's completely normal. And so don't, it's not something to give yourself a hard time about, because we just need more life experience, or we need more resources, more internal resources, or we need more external resources to really complete that grief work. And it can take several times of coming back to therapy to complete something. But then, every time we do therapy on it, we get a little bit freer. We move some energy, we get a bit more unstuck. And then when we finally deal with it and complete that work, we're free. We're completely free. And that we're unstuck, unblocked, and we can move on. And what a fabulous feeling that is. And what an incredible change I've seen in many of my clients over the years when they get to that point. It is wonderful. It's like a cause for a huge celebration. So, don't think, oh, I'm hopeless, or I can't do this, or whatever. You're human, and human beings, this is what we do. It's perfectly normal. So don't give yourself a hard time about it. Just time to do some more work, that's all, when you're ready. Does anybody else have any questions? No. Okay, good. I've gone very over tonight, but it doesn't really matter. So we're just going to have some meditation, and then we'll finish. So if you just allow yourself to sit comfortably, take a couple of deep breaths, and bring your awareness into that safe place inside, into that quiet, still, beautiful place inside where you connect, where I connect with myself, and I let go of everything else. And in this place of stillness, I begin to feel this emanation of peace. I move deeply and more deeply into the stillness towards the dimension of silence. A place where I let go of everything. I let go of the world. Everything recedes. And I am just floating. In the silence. I feel the love surrounding me. This ocean of love and peace. All around me. I'm immersed. And I feel myself with love and with the power of the divine, of the source. Om Shanti.